I'll start by giving a brief overview of the of the very full project and the book, and then go on to some discussion points as Andrew mentioned. So that's the routine I'll go through, and I'll discuss our concept of verification as I do so. The very full project, just to give you some background, is a collaboration between ODI, CATIA in Latin America, C4 Central African Office, and RECOFT in Thailand. And latterly, since 2008, Traffic in South America as well, with funding from the European Commission and the governments of Netherlands and Germany, and is dealing with the issue of the verification of legality on all three continents. For those of you, I'll just give a little bit of background for those of you who are not from the forest sector and don't know these issues, and apologies to those who are doing them already. The problem area is the high levels of illegality in the timber trade and the association between illegality and low standards of public governance. Private sector instruments have had some success, but uneven levels of take-up, and donor conditionalities likewise. Now I'll just give some of the background and graphics on that, if you like. Is going to come up? Okay, deforestation, highest deforestation rates concentrated in the humid tropics, particularly in South America and Central Africa. Asia's a little bit needs a bit of reading because of the reforestation in China, which offsets the deforestation in Indonesia, Malaysia, and the other countries. Governance tends to overlay this with allowance for the governance issues around the former Soviet bloc. So there's a lot of parallels between failures of governance and high levels of deforestation, and links through to the question of legality. Of course, we have to be careful how we interpret perception surveys, but I think that the broad theme is apparent. Now, when we come to look at certification, you can see the problem immediately. That's the hectares under certification, and you can see that North America and Europe, very high hectarage, whereas the problem areas of Asia, Latin America, and Africa particularly, very low hectarage. And if you take a look at that in terms of areas certified as a percentage of the total regional forest cover, the problem is even more evident. Very high proportion of cover in Western Europe, medium level of cover in North America, and much lower cover in the tropical regions. Those were figures from 2006, so slightly out of date, but not very significant. Now, this is a graph that was by Steve Bass of IID, and I thought it was a useful one to focus on for a minute. The critique of certification is that too much of the investment of certification or improved forest management is around this horizontal line of acceptable forest practice, so that the extra costs are being loaded onto those who are actually very close to the levels of acceptable practice. The problem area, which certification was originally around the time of Rio intended to address, is at the bottom of the curve, and certification is not really addressing that at all. So it's in this context that that verification comes in as a complementary tool to help national systems improve the quality of forest management. We have a number of different kind of instances to work from. Countries with a largely domestic agenda, such as Ecuador, Costa Rica, Philippines, British Columbia, Canada. Not entirely domestic, but certainly a resolution of the problems in domestic terms, even if some of the pressures to set up these systems have been external pressures. Then we have bilateral trade agreements, of which the most prominent is the EU VPAs, which are presently under negotiation with a number of countries, although there are some others, such as the US-Peru Free Trade Agreement. There are some additional measures, for example, in the case of the EU public procurement procedures and Lacey Type Act, which is under discussion. And in all these cases, typical of the forest sector, co-benefits have been important, particularly governance, equity, biodiversity, and environment. So as is typical of forest policy, a number of different agendas are being advanced at the same time. And the research challenge for us then in the very full project was how to learn from and support such movements in ways that are equitable, that are developmentally sound and strengthen national policy processes, and which are sustainable. Okay, just to move to the book in outline now, and as Andrew said, it's available as a free download on the web for anybody who hasn't got it. It's also available for sale. We've used 4 main sources of knowledge in this book. The first source is national verification initiatives, such as those which I've just described, including the ones in brackets, which are the emerging VPAs. We've also looked at experience of independent observation or independent forest monitoring. Perhaps it might be best called independent observation, as it's not a routine monitoring activity. The kind of thing that's been very prominent in the press, for example, Global Witness's work in Cambodia and Cameroon and Honduras and elsewhere. We then looked at other intrasectoral experiences, particularly forest certification and the role of technologies. And then we've also examined extrasectoral learning, such as the Kimberley process in diamonds, CITES, UNFCCC, verification of the climate change regime, atomic energy, food standards, and so on. And then some processes which overlap with the policy process development in these cases, such as the work of multi-stakeholder dialogues. The picture I've just that's shown at the top here is actually of alluvial diamond digging in Sierra Leone, and I mention that partly because one of our most downloaded case studies has been the case study of Kimberley diamonds, which has been downloaded an average of 5 times a day since it was posted on the web, and that's comparable to some of the highest selling, if you like, forest sector case studies as well, such as Malaysia, which is not the same area. The book is structured around 4 main themes, and I'll just go through this very briefly. The themes are political mandate, legal basis, design, and results. And if you follow those through down to the columns, you'll see how we have structured the book. The political mandate concerns the aims of verification. You know, what are the drivers behind the instituting of the process of verification? That leads to identification of a key conceptual theme of ownership. How do you engender national ownership of the verification process? The legal basis theme leads with a similar logic down to the issue of legality standards. Clearly you can't verify unless you have standards to verify against. How do you select these standards? Then the design issue leads through to the key thing of independence, because for a system to have legitimacy and credibility, it has to have independence. How do you build that into the system? And then finally, the outcomes of verification, the whole purposes of them, and we've focused particularly on the developmental impacts, the co-benefit impacts. The contents of the book, I won't dwell on too long, but they're there for you to read. With 12 forest sector case studies, 7 cross-cutting themes, and 6 sectoral case studies, and we draw out a set of principles of verification and some policy messages, which are grouped by the 4 themes, which I've outlined in blue there: the ownership, legality standards, and so on. Okay, now let me just hesitate here to talk a little bit about our concept of verification, because this is an issue, and it's clearly verification is one of those problematic words which has a number of levels of meaning in discourse as well as in official language. So we need to clarify a bit what it is we're talking about. We have, our starting point was what separates verification from routine forest management and routine forest control. And we, for our subject matter, we have focused upon 2 particular qualities. The first is doubt. Doubt about the functioning of a normal forest control system. And the second is additionality. In other words, additional measures, additional actors to deal with that element of doubt about the functioning of normal systems. Those actors may be transnational actors, and that's a particular interest of ours, clearly in the forest sector, where you have a presumption of sovereignty, where you have transnational influences on policy. That's a particular area of research interest for ODI and our partners. But not only, I mean, in some cases they're not transnational actors. Now, taking that broad view, has a number of benefits for us. First of all, it encourages an inclusive approach which allows variability in design and which focuses upon what we regard as crucial to an effective verification system: legitimacy, credibility, and robustness. I think all of those working in the forest sector know that you have a diversity of stakeholder interests, and robustness is therefore a key requirement, because you're always going to have challenges to forest management system from one constituency or another. Verification is then seen as broader than routine forest control. We haven't been just out to describe national forest control systems. We're keen to go beyond those, where there are special measures, if you like. And it also is not coterminous with independent forest monitoring or third-party monitoring. That is one possibility, but it's not the only one that we have looked at in our work. And I'll just underline this point by showing three systems that we would regard as, all of them as verification systems, although they have rather different qualities. There's the first one. This is the most prominent at the present time. This is the EU Timber Legality Assurance System. One of the architects of it, Q Switchley, is sitting in the corner there and looking away. That is one approach, and is helping to structure national negotiations, and not necessarily be the actual model which is delivered in any national case. Now, in that situation, you can see that verification is within the green box, and third-party monitoring is seen as, to some extent at least, a separable activity, but an identified activity. So that's one model for verification. But we've got two other. I could show you a lot more, but I'll show you two others here. First of all, the second one is the Ecuador model, which has unfortunately fallen by the wayside, which in my view is very unfortunate. It was a very interesting model. And I haven't got time to go into that. In order to understand the dynamics of that, I think you have to read the chapter of the book. But what is interesting there is we have no single step, for example, that would be regarded as the verification step in the system. We have no single step that would be regarded as third-party monitoring. It is the construction of the whole system that provides that. So there's an alternative model. And here again is a third model. This is Bruce's system from British Columbia, the Forest Practices Board. And you can see underneath the central box there's a particularly important oval of forest practice audits there. Now, again, in that system, it's a constellation of actors. It's not single actors that define that system. And Bruce will talk in more detail about that shortly. So we would see all those as being verification systems in our term, in terms of doubt and additionality. Now, what kind of conclusions have we drawn from the book? Well, we've not provided a single off-the-shelf answer, and I don't think anybody working in this field would expect that. But a few points to make. I mean, the first one would be that verification does need to be placed in a broader framework of forest and wider public governance reform. And without that framework, it's quite difficult to advance an effective verification system. Why? Well, first of all, because the underlying structural weaknesses will be untouched. And those weaknesses can be of a variety of types. You could argue, for example, let me go on a little bit to the pressure point. The underlying structural weaknesses will not be touched. And this approach allows you to focus upon governance pressure points which will allow those weaknesses to be addressed. You could argue, for example, that the critical step where you must ensure there is adequate investment is monitoring of concession allocations. And that's a critical step. And in terms of value for money, it may not be sufficient, but it's necessary. And it's necessary because that goes to the heart of political economy. And if concessions are being allocated in an arbitrary or politicized fashion, then clearly you can't have an effective verification system built around that model. So a first point would be to argue that. The second point would be to say, well, what is the underlying governance problem in many forest sectors? It is decisions are taken by single individuals behind closed doors with no transparency. Clearly, if you can't address that governance deficiency, you're going to have great difficulties putting in place a verification system. So you've got to place verification within a broader framework of forest and public governance. There is value in an architectural approach. Perhaps to some extent the problems of Ecuador have drawn this into question, but I still think it is valid, even if it is not guaranteed. in the sense that it's the constellation of players more than their individual competences which determines effectiveness. And you could argue that systems which are too dependent upon individual actors will be very fragile, for one of two reasons. Either those actors will very soon find themselves in fundamental schism with the system, because that's where the conflict point lies, or alternatively, those actors will be bought off. You need a system in which no single player can control the workings of the whole system. The second point there is to promote inclusion. I mean, it's logical in a system with very many different stakeholders that an inclusive approach is more likely to be stable and successful than one which divides constituencies. I would recommend you to look at the Ghana case study there in the Ghana VPA, because Ghana, I think, has done well to avoid a bifurcation of its market into international market and national market. And we've seen from other industries like food processing that that's very important to maintain one market. Otherwise, you channel illegality down certain tracks. And then thirdly, whatever model you put in place, allow for progressive improvements, particularly to where it's infeasible to guarantee full independence from the start, to allow for a gradual ratcheting up of the model. And Guillermo will talk about that. Okay, just a couple of discussion points to end for those who are interested in the kind of wider ODI agenda. And that one of the big areas of debate is, does globalization, or at least internationalization, we're talking about institutions as well as economic forces, create a downward pressure on regulatory standards? And for those of you who've been following it, there are two models. One is the Delaware model, which is a race to the bottom, and the other one is the California effect, which is a race to the top. California belies the assumption of globalization that as we internationalize trade, standards will be progressively lowered, and there will be a race to the bottom. Delaware exemplifies that. If you look at all American credit card companies, they're all based in Delaware because the regulatory controls are the least in Delaware. But California offers an alternative model, because in California you have very powerful green jurisdictions excuse me, which can force nations and operators to raise standards. And they do that by forming an alliance with the environmental movement. Now that raises some quite interesting research questions about environmental NGOs and how they pursue their interests. And is there a danger of running with the hare as well as hunting with the hounds, if you like? If you are creating the pressures for major environmental improvements and are working through the system. And I think if you look at the problems of countries like Ecuador with its VPA, you'll see how those tensions play out. There are other problems in Ecuador. It's not entirely an issue of environmental NGOs, but the environmental actors did find themselves with conflicting pressures upon themselves, and those pressures are then exploited by their opponents. Finally, what's the way forward to link verification to other instruments in the forest sector? Ben Kershaw, who is one of the leading actors on this and spoke at our November meeting, would argue that certification exists to maintain high standards, and verification is to eliminate the poorest performers. And I mean, there's a logic in that, but with one proviso, and that is if the underlying aim is governance reform, we have to look at what that means in terms of the development of a national economy, a national political economy. If it means that you are excluding from the economy the main class actors who will progress that economy through a process of national capital formation and national class identity, then there is an issue there as to whether the aim for governance reform will actually in the long term be achieved. The poor performance in the forest sector, unfortunately, are very often the national enterprises for a variety of reasons. But I think there is an issue that's got to be looked at there, and I end by saying that we really need to keep our eye on what happens to national enterprises, because if the aim is governance reform, it is through national enterprise that we will see in the long term governance change. So that's my presentation. I'll now pass on to...
Thank you very much, David.